la Tess Knighton, historiadora de la música, amb formació en musicologia i literatura espanyola i francesa. És membre emèrita del Clare College de Cambridge i des del 2011 professora ICREA, actualment afiliada a la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. La seva recerca s'ha centrat en els arxius de Barcelona, investigant la música en l'entorn de la cort i la vida musical quotidiana urbana a Espanya entre el 1450 i el segle XVII. Ha col·laborat amb historiadors en diversos camps, com art, religió, literatura i etnomusicologia, i ha estat editora de la revista Early Music. El seu últim llibre es titula Listening of Confraternities. I el Sergi González, benvingut, doctor en musicologia per la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. Les seves principals línies de recerca se centren en l'estudi del paisatge sonor, la musicologia i l'etnomusicologia. El prisma dels SOUNDSPACE i de les humanitats digitals li proporcionen les eines necessàries per al desenvolupament de les seves investigacions, emmarcades dins de les noves fronteres de la recerca musicològica, amb especial atenció a les manifestacions festives històriques i les connexions que s'estableixen amb els espais urbans. Actualment treballa en el projecte ERC, How Precisions Move, SOUNDSPACE in Performance of Urban Ritual, entre el 1400 i el 1700, sota la supervisió de Tess Knighton, que tenim al costat, i la seva presentació que ens proposen per títol The Concept of Sound Space in Analysis of Musical Experience of the Past. Quan vulgueu.
Moltes gràcies. I gràcies a tots, a Marga, a Zorana i a Miquel per organitzar aquesta jornada d'estudis que és molt interessant. I'm going to speak in English, and you'll be very happy about that, given my Catalan. And Sergi will speak in Catalan when he takes over. Really what we want to do is simply give you a very brief overview of the project financed by the European Research Council, on which we're working at the moment. And this is how processions moved, sound and space in the performance of early modern ritual, circa 1400 to circa 1700. And the idea for this project grew out of my research since I came to Barcelona in 2011 on the daily musical experience in a 16th century urban centre, such as Barcelona. The work is very much based on archival research, on music in the ceremonial and in the domestic context. I'm looking at the involvement of inhabitants of the city in different musics heard in different spaces, in churches, streets and squares, and in their homes, regardless of musical training or ability, and looking at written and unwritten musical practices, and the importance of those institutions that are so little studied because they're not great cathedrals or, forgive me, great monasteries, but are parish churches and confraternities. So trying to balance that with, or integrating all of that into what we know about cathedrals and about music at court. A lot of my research has therefore been based on material and parish church records. And this really was the trigger for the project for two main reasons. Okay. I wanted to know what a ritual like a procession, what impact it had on those who participated and those who experienced it as it passed by. So there are two key questions, really. One that relates to movement in a corporeal sense, the kind of rhythm of the procession, and its dynamic and performative aspects. And secondly, what this movement in terms of moving people that is their emotional engagement, and how that related to questions of collective memory and time passing over the liturgical year. So basically, I'm trying to look at the meaning of processions for those who participated and witnessed them, and the role that sound had in those processions, or I really should say, sound space, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, because I think they're inseparable, really. So this presents many problems for the historian, because we cannot go back in time, we cannot ourselves participate in a procession from 500 years ago. Indeed, we may even have some interference from processions that are still held today, some of them over 8 centuries or 800 years. But does that really help us with knowing the impact of procession so long ago? So I use these two main quotes here encapsulate these ideas. So participants in processions may experience values and symbols, but the key thing is that they do so while being made to move through structured spaces. So this is the idea that of movement through space, and how that impacts on the role of sound in communicating meaning. And secondly, what did it feel like to witness and participate in a ritual? So this is a key question which we're endeavoring to answer. Here we have, what do we have here? Yes. Just a summary of kind of the questions that we're asking ourselves. So how processions were organized and mounted, how processions were received and perceived, how processions held meaning for those present, and how processions generated emotional impact. So we're looking at processions of all type, ordinary processions, extraordinary processions, daily processions, 5-yearly processions, or whatever, and how to analyze and understand the non-tangible elements: movement, time, expectations, memory. There are many studies that talk about the objects that are carried in processions, the dress of those participating in processions. The intangible elements are much harder to gauge. But the tangible objects, the material objects, and the spaces through which the processions passed gave meaning to the processions, and we're trying to identify those meanings. We're also, I think this is the next slide. Yeah, we're also using a number of digital humanities tools, and Sergi will talk about this, so I won't go into detail here, in order to enhance our research, questions, and hopefully the visualization of our results at the end of the project. This is what Nicholas Terpstra, who has done a very detailed study on Florence, using mapping particularly, calls digitally inflected research. The point being that using these tools can help you go beyond what you thought the questions were. Other questions arise as you try to bring together archival research and tools that can deal with large amounts of information and bring in factors such as a restitution of acoustic space and so on. But I will leave that to Sergi. Okay, very briefly, such a project absolutely needs an interdisciplinary approach. And here you can see the different members of the research team. We are 10 altogether, actually 11, counting myself. And you can see that there are researchers from different disciplines relating to history of architecture, history of music, obviously, history of religion and ritual, and also from sound studies, which has been very helpful approach. I was very interested in Zorana's presentation about acoustic measurements. So we also have ethnomusicology, bringing a more anthropological approach, and it's complicated, but I think it's absolutely essential. So very briefly then, I'm going to mention one of the aspects that we've been developing since the project started, and that is this idea of the relationship between sound and space. The acronym I chose for the project was in fact SOUNDSPACE, all one word, and we decided that actually this was a useful term to develop in the context of what we were trying to do. So I would define SOUNDSPACE as the performance of sound in space in the context of daily life, and how sound and space combine to create emotional atmospheres in urban ritual. I've drawn on some ideas from Michel Certeau's study of daily life, which first came out in French in 1980. And I think it helps to give us, or to contribute to a kind of theoretical framework behind the concept of sound space, based on what I've mentioned before, the idea of sound, sonic and musical experience in daily life in the urban context. He discusses how the idea of how movement through the city, the paths that people treaded, or trod, actually, through the city, created patterns not only of location and meaning of spaces, but also how networks were established and how patterns and practices were developed within the city, the urban space. So these are networks belonging to family, trade, parish, confraternity, that were forged in activities relating to daily life. And in a sense, what he says is that they spatialized the city. I will give an example in a minute, but we then have to think beyond the spatialization. How did the movement of sound through those trajectories actually work? Because they followed established paths established by daily life experience, and they took with them sound. So on the one hand, you've got sounds that are static, like bells from bells towers, but you also have handbells, for example, that move through the city in the course of a procession, or you have trumpets that go ahead and give warning, as it were, of what is to follow. If I could just very briefly just give a visual, an image to this concept of spatialization of the city, and the idea that, as in the top picture, which is Brown and Hergenberg's well-known engraving of 1572 of the city of Barcelona, with a viewpoint, a static viewpoint from Montjuïc across the city. You see the topography of the city extremely well. It's very clear. You can see the sea, you can see the city walls, you can see the main buildings, especially the churches with their bell towers. You can see the Ramblas. You can see this part of the city, which was at that time undeveloped and really consisted of gardens and orchards to supply the city. So you got a very good overview of the topography, a kind of bird's eye view. But what can you hear? What can you hear from Montjuïc? Well, we need Jordana to go and measure the distances. But essentially, it's an image that suggests sound, but it gives you nothing about how that sound worked at street level. Okay? So the second image, this map, from the late 17th century. We don't have very good detailed maps of Barcelona, unfortunately, from earlier. But I think it begins to give you an idea of what the experience of sound in ritual would be as the processions wound their way through this spatialized zone. Where at ground level, you would experience sounds from different directions, from up above, from the bell towers or the minstrels who played in the bell towers on festive days. You would hear sounds approaching, going away. You would hear sounds without being able to see round the corner as to what was occurring. So really that's just to give an idea of this concept of how we might approach looking at sound in the city. And I'm going to stop there because Sergi needs to say something.
Okay. Com bé ha explicat la professora Knighton, són tres les línies principals que s'estan desenvolupant en el projecte SOUNDSPACE. A banda de la investigació profunda que requereix cada línia, al mode tradicional, les tres línies tenen una forta càrrega dins del món de les humanitats digitals. Aquestes eines, cada cop més, ens ofereixen múltiples recursos que porten a millorar i portar les investigacions a punts inimaginables que fa 10 anys no s'haurien plantejat. Els horitzons i les fronteres s'obren i ens porten a repensar noves aproximacions metodològiques. Aquest desenvolupament també és una arma de doble tall. El món digital avança tan ràpid que ens obliga a reciclar-nos, a estudiar i considerar noves propostes que apareixen al mercat. La pròpia idiosincràsia de la tecnologia comporta que allò avui és una avantguarda, en un breu espai de temps es converteix en obsolet, amb les implicacions i consideracions que això comporta. Aquestes metodologies estan encaminades a una obsolescència programada molt pròpia del segle XXI. Una investigació humanística acaba convertint-se en una experiència immersiva del propi investigador que planteja múltiples interrogants i les conseqüents cerques de metodologies adequades. Precisament, això és el que succeeix quan ens endinsem en l'estudi acústic de les processons en el context mediterrani de la península ibèrica del segle XVI, que s'està duent al terme al projecte SOUNDSPACE. La interdisciplinaritat pròpia del projecte ens ha portat a reflexionar i combinar diferents metodologies que es fomenten en els conceptes que s'estan desenvolupant actualment, a partir d'eines provinents de l'estudi històric de la música, l'etnomusicologia, la musicologia urbana i les humanitats digitals, entrant en els diferents matisos propis de cada disciplina. Thank you. Respecte a la línia 1, la part relacionada amb les humanitats digitals és la restitució parcial de la primera processó de les lletanies menors que es duia a terme a València durant l'edat moderna. Aquesta part de la investigació està molt avançada i en aquests moments ja s'està treballant en la reconstrucció virtual, amb la intenció de crear una experiència immersiva a partir de l'ús d'ulleres de realitat virtual, on l'usuari podrà estar dins, de manera literal, de la processó. A mode d'exemple del treball de camp que vam realitzar a València durant l'abril de l'any passat, us portem 2 vídeos. El primer, acústicament, us sonarà a la segona comunicació d'avui al dematí. El primer és la presa de dades sòniques al claustre del monestir de Sant Domènec per poder modelitzar a posteriori el so amb el software Unity, i el segon és l'escaneig amb el dron de la maqueta de la ciutat de Mallorca per poder realitzar la modelació visual amb el software Easy Focus 3. Aquest és la modelització visual, que si veieu, allà hi ha un dron que està volant, que és el que està agafant la imatge per després portar-la amb un software. Ara, quan se veieu la càmera, també veuran un aparell aquí a la dreta, a la vostra dreta de la pantalla, sí, que és el que llança imatges, és aquest que es veu aquí, per extreure informació visual de la maqueta per portar-lo després al focus. Respecte a la línia 2, estem parlant de topografia sònica. Ens trobem davant del que anomenem cartografia històrica o mapping. A la pantalla podem veure el flux de treball que estem realitzant en aquesta part del projecte. Actualment el treball a les ciutats de Tarragona, València i Barcelona està força avançat. I a partir de l'abril començarem el treball amb intensitat a Mallorca. Els resultats que estem tenint en aquesta línia ens permeten entendre l'ocupació de l'espai urbà durant les processons i ser capaços de discernir el perquè dels circuits processionals i veure la relació intrínseca que es té el so amb l'espai i el moviment. D'aquesta manera podem entendre el perquè dels sons característics de les ciutats i la certa preferència que es té per desenvolupar performances musicals en alguns espais per davant d'altres. També ens ofereix la possibilitat de calcular, entre d'altres, la velocitat mitjana de les processons, l'ocupació de l'espai urbà, el càlcul de la densitat acústica acumulada durant un any i l'anàlisi de les càpsules sonores que es discretitzen en els diferents SOUNDSPACES que nosaltres triem o les fonts ens proporcionen. Finalment, a la línia 3 ens apareix la intel·ligència artificial, molt de moda en els últims temps. Aquesta línia és la més incipient i també la que va canviant molt més ràpid. Doncs els avenços en el camp de la intel·ligència artificial són molt ràpids i el que avui en dia és molt nou en un mes es queda en obsolet. I ja han sortit noves propostes. La idea és l'anàlisi de textos per poder, a ser possible i viable, entendre com es preparava emocionalment a la societat per assistir i entendre les processons i veure com aquestes s'acabaven convertint també en un sistema de control social molt jerarquitzat. La idea no parteix de localitzar els textos seleccionant paraules relacionades amb música, cosa fàcil que ja es fa, no podríem parlar de trompeta quantes vegades ens apareix. No és el cas, sinó el que volem és molt més difícil, és la interrelació entre paraula, so, música, context i emoció. En definitiva, analitzar com el so i la música en les processons urbanes, medievals i renaixentistes van influir en les respostes emocionals i la cohesió social, integrant estudis acústics i històrics a partir de l'examen de discursos sensorials i emocionals. Aquesta part de la investigació aborda desafiaments hermenèutics amb l'ambigüitat de la descripció històrica de les emocions i sons, aplicant un enfocament interdisciplinari que connecta musicologia, història cultural i estudis de gènere. Fins aquí. Thank you so much for your attention. Moltes gràcies per la vostra atenció i qualsevol cosa aquí estem després.